Hello, I am Dr. Craig Schluttenhofer. I am the Research Assistant Professor of Natural Products at Central State University. My primary focus is on the genetics and biochemistry of cannabis for agriculture and medicinal uses. So the crop I work with is primarily hemp. The hemp that you see here today is grown for its metabolites. We call it metabolite hemp or essential oil hemp. Some people just call it CBD hemp, but we're really beyond just looking at CBD as these metabolites at this point in time. There's a lot of interest in other cannabinoids as well as the terpene component. And so these are all CBD varieties, so there's 3 different varieties and there's duplicates of each one within this field. And so this is a crop that's really going to be planted in June, then it's going to start flowering in around mid to late August, and then within about 5 weeks or so the flowers are going to be ready for harvesting. They're going to be typically hand harvested because there's a general lack of mechanized equipment to do so, although that is being developed by some companies at this point in time. But once that's harvested, it's going to be dried, and it'll either go to an extraction or used raw in smokable, what we call smokable hemp products or premium hemp products. And so both of the extracts and those smoked products are typically being used for medicinal purposes. Even though those claims haven't been validated by the FDA, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence as well as some clinical studies suggesting that CBD and these other metabolites have various medicinal benefits. And so that's really what this market's oriented at, is using this crop for those particular properties. Common things that, again, aren't approved by the FDA but are being used for is either just general wellness, anxiety, pain, things like that. And so it'll be interesting to see how that goes forward as an industry, but that's the main use for this particular type of crop. And so here we're doing research on the metabolite hemp, just to understand its chemistry better, to understand its production better, and really look at some of these factors that as they relate to the regulatory aspects of the crop. Yeah, so the end product for metabolite hemp crop is going to be typically the flower. Some people collect that flower individually, either from cutting the whole plant and then drying it and then cutting the flower off, or cutting the flower off and drying that separately. Other people will harvest the whole plant and then they'll strip the leaves and the flower off and use that. Typically, the fibrous stalk material is excluded, although there's some more mechanized methods that do incorporate that as well, just because they can't easily separate that from the product, and so then you're extracting what includes some of the stalk material as well. Yeah, so there's 3 kind of main crops for hemp, and how you grow them really depends on which of those crops you're after as your primary crop. Some people have tried combining and doing what's called dual or triple cropping systems, but the 3 main cropping systems are either for the metabolites, for grain, or for fiber, and they're all going to be grown differently. The metabolites, as again seen here, are typically grown far apart. These rows are extra far apart just for research purposes. Normally this rows would only be about 4 to 5 feet apart, and the plants would be 4 to 5 feet apart within rows. They're going to get very bushy, and that's because you're after that flower material. Whereas the grain is going to be planted at a much higher density. You're looking somewhere around 500,000 plants per acre. They're going to grow to about ideally 4 to 6 feet tall, 5 feet really being that ideal height you're looking at, because you're going to come through with a combine and cut below those flower heads to harvest that grain when it's ready. And if you get that too tall, you can't get that combine head up high enough to avoid all the fibrous stalk material, which tends to get caught around the gears within the combine, and it could cause things like combine fires and gear malfunctions. The fiber, on the other hand, you're planting even higher density than the grain. You're looking at well over 1 million plants per acre, upwards to 1.5 million plants per acre. And there you're trying to get the plants to grow thin stalks but as tall as possible, and so you're really trying to force that competition between plants to make them grow tall, get those real long fibers, so you don't want those branches involved, as you do with the CBD and metabolite crops where you get more flowers that way. Fiber, you just want a long continuous fiber the entire length of the stalk, and so you're trying to force that competition for them to grow up and very tall. And so you want something that's over 10 feet tall in those crops. It can get up to 15 foot tall in some countries, and that's really what we need to push for a good sustainable fiber production system in the U.S. to get the yield that we need. To make a crop financially feasible and the amount of area you would need, again, depends on those types of crops that you're looking at. It's going to take substantially more land area for grain and fiber systems than it is for a metabolite system. Ohio has regulations that require a minimum of 1/4 of an acre and 1,000 plants. And so typically if you're growing for metabolites, those 1,000 plants are going to get you probably more up to about a 1/2 acre in size instead of 1/4 acre. And there's various reasons those requirements were put in place. As far as the financial potential for this crop, it's constantly changing, and we're really, as more states come online with production, including Ohio, which this is really our first year of commercial production. Last year there was a big price drop because of so many more states coming online, and they were interested in producing these CBD and these metabolite crops, that there was an oversupply and not a corresponding increase in demand, and so those prices really dropped, and they've remained fairly low this year. And so the amount of land that's going to be profitable is very hard to predict. There's a lot of information that we still need to know about this crop at this point in time. There's also a lot of variability in how this crop is done, and so as you can see with this crop, there's no plastic laid down between the rows to keep the weeds down. Other people put the plastic down. That alone adds cost, and so those costs are all factor up in everybody's systems on drying and harvesting, and how much labor is required for that really makes it very difficult at this point in time to predict the economics of the crop and to say, okay, this is going to be a profitable crop for you. It really requires a lot of personal research and fitting that into your existing cropping system, and that's something that is absolutely essential each and every grower does themselves, because it could very well be more expense than you would make, especially since those prices have dropped from what people had been hearing of making $20,000-$30,000 an acre. That's no longer the case, and it's unlikely that those prices are ever going to return, that it's going to be that profitable. And so it's coming down, and we're finding what that actual market value is going to be at, and we're still discovering that, so it's very, very difficult to predict at this point in time. As far as where the market demand is and what we need to do to improve that, and whether there's growers that have gotten into hemp are going to stay in hemp or leave because of the prices, we're figuring all of that out. That's as an industry. And one of the things I guess I'll start with on that is, as far as consumer awareness, I think there is a need for more consumer awareness. There's particularly a need for consumer awareness on differentiating hemp and, quote, marijuana products, or products that have more than that 0.3 limit of percent THC limit, which defines hemp from what is legally classified as marijuana. A lot of people refer to that as just cannabis at this point in time for its technical name. But legally there is that distinction. And so there's a lot of consumers that don't understand that differentiation, and that hemp is not a intoxicating plant, whereas quote, marijuana would be. And so there is a need for that consumer awareness. There is a eventually going to be a cap on how much is actually needed by the industry. As with any crop, you can't just produce a indefinite supply of it. We see this with corn and soybeans. A lot of times growers are left with waiting for better market prices to try to sell their crop. But there they can generally sell the crop. Here, really, you need a contract, ideally with somebody to sell it to up front, more like a tobacco system, or a small vegetable system where you have an outlet for what you're producing, because you can't just take it down to the grain elevator and sell it, and so you're not necessarily guaranteed to get paid for it. So consumer awareness could help with that to an extent. I think really diversifying uses for the crop are, particularly for the metabolites, are going to be useful going forward, and that's something that we really need to look at as an industry, is what other applications we have for these medicinal type plants. The amount of labor required to grow hemp is quite extensive, especially for the metabolite side. For the grain and fiber side, it can be more mechanized, and so the labor requirement there is less, but particularly for the metabolite production, you're looking at typically, for most growers, a similar labor requirement as a tobacco crop. It's a very labor intensive. You got a lot of weeding, but really there's a transplanting out in the spring that's requires some labor. A lot of people use old tobacco or vegetable setters to do that. That is a relatively smaller component of the labor requirement. Most comes on the back end with the harvesting and the drying and the stripping to remove those flower material off. And so that could take a lot of time and is a big labor cost, and that's why people are really interested in mechanizing those particular steps. This is my specialty. I've been working with it since 2014 at this point, so it'd be 6 growing seasons at least. So I've been working with this crop a lot. I started at Central State last year, and I was hired to bring that expertise to the state from Kentucky, where I was working previously. So feel free to reach out to me, or feel free to reach out to Central State Extension, who could put you in contact with me if they can't answer the questions that you may have. We do have a couple extension bulletins up discussing different growing requirements for the 3 different crops that can be found on our website as well as the ODA website. And we also have a second extension bulletin that we're working on getting out that we have finalized. We just need to get it more readily available, looking at what factors that you need to consider as if you're looking at growing hemp as a crop, and what to kind of expect as you go forward and need to do to get started off on the right foot.